As the sun set over the battlefield, the soldiers in the trench felt a strange calm. The deafening sounds of gunfire and artillery seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the rustling of the wind and the occasional shout from a distant comrade. The trench, though cramped and muddy, had become a haven of sorts, their refuge from the chaos that raged just beyond the barbed wire. Safe, they thought, a familiar word among the soldiers. The earth beneath them, though scarred from years of warfare, seemed solid enough. Their hands gripped the familiar tools of survival, rifles, bayonets, the occasional hand grenade, all ready for action, but tucked away in the corners of their minds. They were soldiers, hardened by months of conflict, yet this trench gave them a false sense of peace, a fleeting moment of respite. There were no immediate threats in sight. The enemy had been pushed back. Their artillery grew quieter with each passing day. They had survived so much already, but in war, peace is never truly permanent. As night fell, the soldiers continued their routine. Some took turns standing watch. Others tried to sleep, resting their weary bodies in whatever dry patches they could find. The world above them seemed distant. It felt as if the trench, despite its mud and decay, had become their new world. The thought of an attack, at least in this moment, seemed remote. They had survived countless battles, and the trench seemed like their final defense. The night passed, and the only sounds that interrupted the silence were the occasional coughs and whispered words between comrades. But, as any seasoned soldier will tell you, it's not the battles you can see that you should fear. It's the ones you can't. The ground beneath them, which had always felt firm and unyielding, suddenly gave way in an unsettling way. A strange vibration, faint at first, then growing stronger. It wasn't the rumble of distant artillery or the crashing of mortar shells. No, this was something else. Something closer? Something far more sinister? Provocative question. What could possibly go wrong when you're entrenched, thinking you're safe? As the vibrations intensified, soldiers began to exchange confused glances. What was happening? Was it an earthquake? Or, perhaps, something more deadly? Something that had been lurking beneath their very feet this entire time. They could feel it now, something they hadn't expected. Something that would soon change their lives forever. If this opening raised the hair on the back of your neck, you're not alone. The feeling of being safe one moment and then realizing you're not the next is a terrifying reality of war. But what happens next in this story is even more shocking. Before we dive into the next part, I want to hear from you. What's the most unexpected moment you've ever experienced in a story about survival? Let me know in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on the untold stories we're bringing you. The vibrations beneath the soldiers' feet were growing stronger, but they didn't yet know the full scope of the threat that was about to unfold. As the earth trembled, many assumed it was just a tremor or an odd, passing phenomenon. However, seasoned soldiers, those who had experienced the brutal reality of trench warfare, could sense the truth. The ground was not just shaking because of artillery, but because of something much more sinister: enemy tunnels. It wasn't the first time they'd heard rumors of underground warfare. The enemy had been known to use these secretive, labyrinthine tunnels to infiltrate, sabotage, and launch surprise attacks. The trenches, once thought to be secure, were now vulnerable from below. The enemy had learned how to use the earth itself as a weapon. The concept of tunnel warfare was not new, but it had become more refined. The enemy soldiers, using their knowledge of the terrain, had dug their way into the very ground the soldiers thought was their safe haven. Each step, Each movement of the earth signaled that the enemy was closer than ever. Beneath their boots, silent footsteps were being taken in the dark by soldiers they couldn't see, but who were just as dangerous as the ones firing from the opposite trenches. Some soldiers could hear it faintly, a slight scratching or tapping sound beneath the surface of the trench walls. It was almost as if the earth itself was being violated, carved out by unseen hands. For those who had been through this before, the knowledge was enough to send a shiver down their spine. Tunnels could mean only one thing: an imminent attack. As the shaking grew stronger, the soldiers' confidence began to wane. Their weapons, their experience, and even the tactical advantage of being entrenched felt useless against this new, unsigned threat. How could they fight back against an enemy they couldn't even see, one that was creeping ever closer under the cover of the very ground they stood on? The trench that had once felt like a fortress, a shield against the chaos of war, now felt more like a trap. Their once comfortable position, safe from direct assault, was now vulnerable from beneath. The enemy had taken the fight to the very foundation of their defenses. Every shift in the earth seemed to echo with the ominous presence of the enemy, digging, preparing, ready to spring their deadly surprise. Provocative question: what do you do when the very ground you stand on becomes your enemy? The soldiers' hearts raced as they began to realize the magnitude of the situation. The sense of security they had felt just moments ago was now shattered, and the ground beneath them seemed to hold an entirely different kind of fear. Every tremor was a reminder that safety was a fleeting illusion in the chaos of war. As the soldiers shifted nervously in their positions, the vibrations beneath them grew more intense, reverberating through the earth like the warning rumble of an oncoming storm. It wasn't a rumble of distant artillery or the crashing of mortar shells. No, this was something different, something more immediate, something that no one could truly prepare for. At first, it was a slight tremor, a subtle shake beneath their feet, almost like a gentle breeze. The soldiers, too accustomed to the noise and chaos of war, barely noticed it. But as the seconds ticked by, the vibrations grew stronger. The soldiers exchanged wary glances, some muttering under their breath about the odd sensation. Was it an earthquake? Could it be artillery? Or something else entirely? But those who had been through the horrors of war before knew better. The ground was shifting in an unsettling way, as if it were being pushed, pulled, and manipulated by some unseen force. Their senses sharpened, their nerves on edge, and they couldn't shake the feeling that this was not just a random tremor. It was something much more deliberate. The earth beneath them wasn't just shaking, it was signaling an attack, a kind of subterranean warfare they hadn't prepared for. No one had heard any enemy movements, no sounds of digging, no signals of impending doom. It was all silent, the calm before the storm, and yet the ground beneath them was trembling with a menacing force. The soldiers began to wonder, could the enemy have been tunneling under them all this time, waiting for the right moment to strike? Had the vibrations they felt been caused by something deeper, hidden just below their feet, something they couldn't possibly detect? What was it that caused the earth to tremble in such an unnatural way? Then the realization set in. It wasn't just the earth shaking anymore. It was as if the earth itself was warning them of something far more dangerous than anything they had ever experienced. The ground beneath them was no longer the solid foundation they had relied on. It had become the very instrument of their fear. The thought settled over them like a suffocating cloud. Something was coming. It wasn't just the enemy on the horizon. It was something closer, something insidious. The tremors grew stronger, more persistent, as if the ground itself were breathing with a life of its own. The men in the trench tightened their grips on their rifles, their hands slick with sweat. They had no idea what was coming, but they knew they would have to face it soon. Provocative question. What do you do when the very ground you trust turns against you? The soldiers were left standing in a moment of suspended terror, unsure of what to do, yet instinctively knowing that whatever came next, they would have to face it head-on. The soldiers had barely begun to process the strange vibrations when it happened. Without warning, the ground beneath them erupted with a deafening roar, a violent explosion that ripped through the air like a thunderclap. The trench, once a safe haven, was instantly thrown into chaos. The earth trembled once more, but this chimney, it wasn't a mere tremor, it was the devastating impact of a mine detonation. For a brief moment, everything went silent. The ringing in their ears drowned out the usual noise of battle. In the wake of the explosion, the soldiers could feel the shockwaves reverberating through their bodies, their hearts pounding in their chests. Dust and debris filled the air, choking them, making it nearly impossible to see anything beyond the immediate destruction. The trench had been their sanctuary, a place where they could catch their breath and strategize. But now it had become a death trap. The soldiers scrambled for cover, some still disoriented from the blast, others clutching their weapons instinctively. The walls of the trench had collapsed in places, and the sharp sound of metal scraping against metal was followed by the terrifying groans of the earth, as if it were collapsing in on itself. It wasn't just the physical destruction that left them reeling. It was the psychological toll. They had felt safe as one could be in a war zone. But in an instant, that sense of security was shattered. The enemy, invisible and hidden below the surface, had breached their defenses without ever showing themselves. The soldiers could feel it. Now this was no random attack. It was a calculated move, one designed to break their morale and force them into submission. As the dust settled and the shock of the blast began to wear off, the soldiers were left with a stark realization. The ground beneath them, which had once seemed like a solid foundation, was now their enemy. It had turned on them, and in doing so, it had exposed their vulnerability. They were no longer safe, no longer in control. They were at the mercy of a force that could strike from below, without warning and without mercy. Provocative question. What happens when the ground you trusted to protect you turns into a weapon against you? As the soldiers rallied, some injured, some shaken to their core, they realized one horrifying truth. They were now engaged in a fight against an enemy they couldn't see, and a war that was waged in the very earth beneath their feet. They were trapped in a silent, hidden battle that would test not only their physical strength, but their very will to survive. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, the trench was a scene of utter chaos. The initial shock had faded, but the devastation left in its wake was palpable. The once sturdy walls of the trench were now in ruins, collapsed in some areas, leaving exposed gaps where soldiers had once sought refuge. The ground was churned up, littered with debris, broken equipment, the twisted remains of barbed wire, and, most tragically, the bodies of fallen comrades. The soldiers, many still dazed from the blast, struggled to regain their bearings. Dust and smoke hung in the air, making it hard to see or breathe. But amidst the disarray, there was one instinct that burned through their shock: survival. They moved quickly, helping the injured, searching for weapons that had been thrown from their hands, trying to assess the damage to their defenses and find a way to continue the fight. But the task was daunting. The trench, once a symbol of safety, had now become a perilous death. The explosions had torn apart not only the physical structure but also the soldiers' sense of security. Every step taken in the shattered trench felt like a gamble, the fear of another explosion never far from their minds. The soldiers quickly realized that survival was not just about finding safety, but about maintaining hope in a situation that seemed impossible. Some of them were injured semi-severely, but there was no time to dwell on personal pain. Every man had to dig deep and push forward, whether it was to tend to the wounded, retrieve essential supplies, or prepare for the next assault. Yet, despite their determination, they couldn't escape the overwhelming sense of dread. How many more mines lay buried in the earth beneath them? How long before the next explosion shattered their fragile hold on survival? The fear of the unknown was almost as suffocating as the smoke in the air. As the soldiers moved forward, patching up the trench and securing their position, the weight of the situation was clear. They were trapped not just by the enemy, but by the very earth beneath them. Provocative question. What do you do when the only place you thought was safe has become a deadly labyrinth? The tension was unbearable, but the soldiers knew they had no choice but to keep moving, to keep fighting. They couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to give in to the overwhelming fear that the ground beneath them was no longer a foundation for survival, but a weapon to be feared. As the soldiers began to stabilize their position in the aftermath of the explosion, an unsettling realization began to take root. This attack was no random act of violence. The blast was too calculated, too precise. It wasn't just a mine that had gone off. It was a trap meticulously set by the enemy to break their spirits and weaken their resolve. In the trenches of World War I and World War II, it wasn't just about brute force or firepower. The battles were often about patience, strategy, and psychological warfare. The enemy knew that the soldiers who fought in these trenches were exhausted, worn down by the constant barrage of attacks, the endless days of waiting, and the pervasive threat of death. And they knew that breaking a soldier's spirit was as effective as any physical weapon. The mine hidden beneath the earth was one such tactic. It wasn't meant to simply kill. It was meant to cause fear, to sow distrust among the soldiers, and to shatter their perception of safety. After all, if the enemy could strike from below, where could they turn for safety? If the earth beneath them wasn't trustworthy, what was left? The enemy's strategy was simple. Use the element of surprise to instill fear. They relied on the unpredictability of the situation, creating traps that could trigger at any moment, catching the soldiers off guard. The soldiers, who had been trained to be alert to the threats from the enemy's guns and artillery, now found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't see, a silent threat lurking beneath the earth's surface. Each explosion, each tremor in the earth was part of a broader plan to destabilize their minds and hearts. It was psychological warfare, an attempt to make the soldiers question everything around them. The trench, once a symbol of defense and security, now felt like a ticking time bomb. The soldiers couldn't know when or where the next attack would come from. The idea of having no control over their surroundings, of being vulnerable even in their most protected space, was a blow to their morale. Provocative question. How do you fight back when the enemy knows how to turn your refuge into your prison? This tactic, though horrifying, was effective. As the soldiers realized that they couldn't trust the ground beneath them, they began to distrust each other. Some soldiers began to blame their comrades for not detecting the traps sooner, while others questioned whether they were being led into a setup. The constant fear and suspicion began to eat away at the cohesion of the unit. It wasn't just the physical threat of the enemy that they had to overcome. It was the fear that the earth itself had become a weapon, one that could strike without warning, without explanation. The soldiers hadn't even fully recovered from the shock of the first explosion when it happened again. The earth trembled once more, but this chimney there was no mistaking the familiar sound, the unmistakable low rumble of a mine detonating beneath their feet. The trench, already compromised from the first blast, seemed to shake more violently. Now it was as if the earth itself had turned against them, mocking their false sense of security. This second explosion was even more devastating than the first. The ground seemed to swallow entire sections of the trench. Dirt and debris rained down, burying some soldiers in the process. The shrill screams of men caught in the blast echoed through the smoke-filled air, punctuated by the sharp crack of collapsing trench walls. The deafening roar of the explosion left many of the soldiers momentarily stunned, unable to comprehend what had just happened. For those who had survived the first explosion, the terror of the second detonation was something even worse. It was confirmation that they were not safe. They had been under the false assumption that once the first blast was dealt with, they would be secure again. But now they realized the horrifying truth. The enemy had laid multiple traps, each one more devastating than the last, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The fear was palpable. Soldiers who had once been confident in their ability to hold their ground now found themselves questioning every step they took. Was there another mine hidden beneath their feet? Could the ground swallow them up at any moment? Each step, each movement felt like a gamble, and the constant tremors only added to the mounting sense of dread. The second mine wasn't just an attack on their physical defenses. It was an attack on their morale. It shattered their hope, left them scrambling for any kind of shelter, any place that could offer even a semblance of safety. But in a battlefield riddled with mines, how could they know where to run? The enemy had made sure they couldn't escape. The trench had become their prison, and now they were trapped, surrounded by invisible threats that could strike without warning. Provocative question. What do you do when the very ground you walk on becomes your enemy? As the soldiers pulled themselves from the rubble, helping the wounded and searching for survivors, the realization set in that they were no longer fighting just for survival. They were fighting to maintain their sanity. The constant threat of death, the fear that each tremor in the earth could signal the next attack, was taking a psychological toll. How long could they endure this silent, invisible war before it broke them completely? The second explosion had left the trench in ruins, but it wasn't just the physical destruction that had shaken the soldiers to their core. It was the realization that their very foundation, the very place they had believed was their last line of defense, was crumbling. The walls that once offered them protection were now torn apart. The once firm earth, now an unstable and deadly battleground. What had once been a solid, fortified position was now a disorienting maze of rubble, fallen soldiers, and unrelenting fear. The trench's collapse wasn't just a structural failure. It was a psychological one. The soldiers had already been stretched thin, their nerves frayed from the constant threat of attack, the ever-present fear of death lurking just outside the trench's walls. But now, with their defenses shattered and their footing unsure, they were faced with the harsh truth. They were no longer in control. Panic set in. It was impossible to tell where the next threat might come from. Could the enemy launch another mine attack? Was it time for a direct assault? The chaos around them became a blur of soldiers shouting orders, the wounded crying for help, and the ground beneath them continuing to shake. They had no choice but to move. to try and reorganize in whatever semblance of safety they could find. But the problem wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The soldiers, already worn down by months of fighting, now faced a new kind of terror. The trench had been their anchor, their point of stability in a world of uncertainty. But now, even that was gone. It wasn't just about surviving the next attack anymore. It was about surviving the psychological toll that came with the realization that their supposed refuge was just as dangerous as the enemy. Provocative question. What happens when the place you thought was your sanctuary becomes the very thing that threatens your life? In that moment, as the soldiers scrambled to rebuild what little they could of their defenses, they knew the fight had just taken on a new dimension. They weren't just fighting the enemy anymore, they were fighting the fear of the unknown, the fear that no place would ever be safe again, not even the earth beneath their feet. In the midst of the chaos, where fear had overtaken reason and survival seemed increasingly impossible, one soldier stepped forward, unlikely hero amidst the madness. While the trench defenses collapsed and soldiers scrambled for shelter, this individual found his calling. It was a moment when leadership, bravery, and quick thinking would prove to be the only things that could make a difference. Amidst the horror, one soldier stood out, not because he was the strongest or the most experienced, but because of his calm under pressure. His name wasn't widely known. He wasn't a seasoned officer or a battle-hardened veteran, yet his actions in that dire moment would forever alter the course of the battle. When the trench collapsed, many of the soldiers were in disarray, struggling to regain control of the situation. There was no leader giving orders, no clear path forward, and the enemy's presence felt like it was closing in on them from every angle. It was in this fractured moment of vulnerability that this soldier, let's call him Private Harris, stepped forward, rallying the men with a calm voice and a clear plan. Without hesitation, Harris began organizing the soldiers, quickly assessing the injured and ensuring that they were taken care of. He didn't waste time giving orders from a distance. He led by example, running into the most dangerous areas, pulling men to safety, and using his knowledge of the trench to find new lines of defense. His decisiveness brought a sense of order to the chaos, and his calmness acted as a stabilizing force for those around him. But it wasn't just his actions that made him a hero, it was the trust he instilled in the men. As the soldiers rallied around him, they could see the fear in his eyes, but they also saw something else: determination. Harris wasn't just trying to survive. He was trying to ensure that his comrades would survive too, in a place where everyone felt the sting of fear. Harris's courage acted as a beacon, reminding the men that they had each other's backs, even in the darkest of moments. Provocative question. In the face of certain death, what makes someone rise above the chaos and lead others to safety? Harris's actions may not have been dramatic or headline-worthy, but they were a testament to the strength of human resilience. He didn't wait for permission, he didn't seek recognition, and he didn't care about the risk to his own life. He simply did what needed to be done to save those around him. His bravery wasn't loud, it was quiet, selfless, and powerful. As the dust from the explosions finally began to settle and the soldiers regrouped, the gravity of what they had just experienced started to hit. The trench that had once been a symbol of safety now lay in ruins, and with it their confidence. The invisible thread that had lurked beneath their feet, the mines, the tunnels, and the unpredictable enemy tactics had turned the battlefield into something far worse than they could have ever imagined. They had survived the explosions, the chaos, and the fear. But there was still something more haunting left behind, the realization that no place was truly safe. The enemy had found a way to infiltrate not just their defenses, but their very minds. The soldiers could no longer trust the ground beneath them, nor could they rely on the familiar rhythm of war. Every step they took, every move they made, felt like a calculated risk, and the fear of the unknown weighed heavily on them. But amid the fear, something else had emerged: resilience. In the face of overwhelming odds, they had found a way to survive. And that survival, however fragile, was something to hold on to. They had seen the worst of warfare, the unexpected, the unseen, and the unimaginable, but they had also seen what they were capable of when they came together. The war had taken so much from them, but it hadn't taken their will to fight. They were still standing, still moving forward. And while they may never forget the fear and uncertainty they faced in that trench, they now knew something far more important. Even when the ground beneath you shakes, even when your world is crumbling, there is still a way to survive, to fight, and to stand strong. If you've made it this far, you've witnessed a story of survival and bravery that will stay with you long after the video ends. If this story moved you, leave a comment below with your thoughts. What do you think it takes to survive in such a situation? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to keep hearing these incredible stories from history. And if you want to dive deeper into another unforgettable chapter, check out the next video on your screen.